Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the Gospels, looking at the 250 events in the life of Jesus. And today we're looking at Jesus' teaching about spiritual blindness. If you've been watching or been following along with us in the last couple of days, we looked at Jesus healing a blind man, the blind man being questioned by the Pharisees and the leaders because one, it was on Sabbath and they want to know how Jesus healed him. And then finally, we finish off John 9:35 through 41 with Jesus talking about spiritual blindness because it's the same, he's still referring to the same people. He finds this man and he's talking and still following along in the same story here. So in verse 35, we pick up and says, when Jesus heard what had happened, the questioning the man and going after the man and what they had kicked him and banned him from the synagogue, he found the man and asked him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? And the man answered, who is he, sir? I want to believe in him. So it's a good question because he wasn't 100% sure. He says, you have seen, Jesus said, or you have seen him, Jesus said, and he is speaking to you. Yes, Lord, I believe, the man said, and he worshiped Jesus. So he believed him when he told him. He was looking for him. Jesus told him who he was, and he worshiped him, and he believed him. And then Jesus told him, I entered this world to render judgment, to give sight to the blind, and to show those who think they see that they are blind. And he's referring to the Pharisees here. And some in verse 40, some Pharisees who were standing nearby heard him and asked, are you saying we're blind? And they're like, are you talking about us? He says, if you were blind, you wouldn't be guilty. Saying, he's saying, if you were truly blind, you wouldn't be guilty, talking about not being able to see who Jesus was. He says, but you remain guilty because you claim that you can see. He's saying you claim you can see, and that's what makes you guilty. If you were blind, and we're going to look at this in a second, you were truly blind and you'd have an excuse. And so if we look at this, right, in verse, if we go back to the notes for this, the man gained not only a physical sight, right? Jesus healed his vision; he could see. So God, or Jesus, he not only did he gain that, but he also gained spiritual sight as he recognized Jesus first as a prophet. We see that in John 9:17, and then as his Lord when Jesus tells him who he is. And so when we turn to Christ, we should, if we truly turn to Christ, we should start to see things and see Him differently. And the longer we walk with him, the better we will understand who he is. And that's like any relationship, right? When you first start a relationship out with someone, friendship, whatever, dating relationship, however, what kind of, it's a little weird at first, right? You're still getting to know each other. It's a little awkward. But the more you spend time with each other, the more you talk to each other, the more you're around each other, the more comfortable you get, the more you get to know each other. And so that's what this, obviously hadn't been a real long time, but the more time this guy spent with Jesus, the more he talked to him, the more he understood who he was. And Peter, right? Peter tells us that we are to grow in the grace and knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. We find that in 2 Peter verses 3 through 18. And so if we want to know more about Jesus, then we need to keep trusting in him every in every area of our life. And we got to spend time in the Word. We got to spend time with him, right? And so that's the only way we get to know Jesus better is by studying. And that's why I like going through the um, the gospels the way we're going through them, because we're able to sit down and chronologically go through all four gospels at the same time and really look at how Jesus lived his life and the type of person that he was. And so I think we get a better understanding of who Jesus was and who we're trying to be. Not to get throw away or not to dismiss the rest of the New Testament, but I truly think as Christians, right, the first four gospels are one of the four most important ones we need to really start with and study. Right? The ones after that are very important. There's a lot of really good instructions for the church there that we need to take in and understand and follow. There's this, but all of that points back to Jesus, right? All of it points back to how would Jesus behave? How would Jesus act? How did Jesus want us to act? We're a reflection of him. And so we have the first four gospels, and then the rest of the New Testament is a reflection of those first four gospels. And so the Pharisees here were shocked that Jesus thought that they thought he was like that they were spiritually blind. It's like, how could you dare? Because they were the ones who were they knew everything, right? They were the ones who knew everything. They had all the knowledge, and they were the smartest, and they were the most educated. So it's like, how can you say we're blind? And so Jesus countered by saying that it wasn't only blindness, right? He's like he's like, yeah, you weren't really blind, because he was actually calling almost like a stubbornness and a little bit of stupidity. It was like, had that, if you were not bright enough, then that would be could excuse your behavior, right? But he says, right, but to those who remained open and recognized how sin and had truly like blinded them from knowing the truth, he gave them a spiritual understanding and insight because they were open. The Pharisees weren't open, and what was worse, it wasn't that they were too dumb to understand, right? It's not that they couldn't understand. It's that he rejected those who became complacent, right? Self-satisfied and truly blind. They were blind because they chose to be blind, right? And they claimed that they could see. They claimed they could see, but they were blind. And so that's what he's calling them out for. He's saying, you know what? If you were actually like almost too dumb to understand this, then you'd have an excuse. He says, if you were blind, you wouldn't be guilty. Meaning, if you couldn't understand this, right? If you couldn't get it, you wouldn't be guilty. He says, but you remain guilty because you claim you can see. And this is where we need to be careful, right? If we claim we have all the answers, this is where we got to be very, very careful. If we claim we have all the answers and we're the only ones who are right and everyone else is wrong, then you're blind. And what I mean by that is we don't have all the answers. And this is something that we're always, every single, there's theology that I have that I'm sure is wrong. There's stuff that I used to teach 5, 8 years ago that I don't teach anymore because I can study it and I've studied through it and I see that I was wrong. I would never teach that again, right? But the simple fact is that I'm open to understanding. If you're not open to learning or being open to learning new things, or maybe going deeper into the stuff that you think there's some things that I've studied and I've thought I've known all my life and I've thought to be true all my life, and I still believe them to be true today because I've studied and studied and studied and I see that, right? But then there's other stuff where I've come back to it and I've questioned it and I've looked at it and I've ran it through the filter of the entire gospel or the entire Old Testament and New Testament, the entire Bible, and it's like, oh, this makes sense this way now. Not if this is the problem we have a lot of times in many churches, right? Is we go and we find one verse and we proof text that one verse and say, oh, this one verse says this, so this applies to everything for all time. And it's like, no, that actually applied to those people for that particular situation, right? We can't take it's like if what you just said counters other things we saw in the Bible, then you're either saying that the Bible contradicts itself, or and I'm not going to go deep into that, but the simple fact is what Jesus is calling us out and saying we have to be open and recognize that we don't know everything, that we can be sinful people, right? And that we're not the only ones who are right. And that's the wonderful thing. I wish we could, as Christian groups, come together and agree on the core points. I mean, there's a lot of the hard facts, right? The hard truths, I call them. Things like, yes, Jesus was God, the Trinity. That kind of stuff, right? You know, we're saved through Jesus's death on the cross and his resurrection, that kind of stuff, right? And we tend to argue about all these little things that really don't matter. Like, I guarantee you there's a lot of things that Jesus comes back that we have thought about or we think we're 100% right on, that when Jesus asks, or when we get to the judgment day, Jesus is not going to ask us about, and he's not going to care about it, right? He's going to, like, we see that he's going to care about how we treat people, and that's the most important thing. And so we, in this message, right, we've got to make sure we're not spiritually blind. And it's like, oh, well, I think a lot of times when we think of spiritually blind people, we think of those outside of the church who just won't, open up to Christ or won't accept Christ or that kind of stuff. And yes, there's a spiritual blindness too, but we need to make sure that us inside the church aren't spiritually blind, and that we're not like the Pharisees. When he talked about the spiritually blind, he was talking about those who were the most, supposedly the most spiritual. And so we need to make sure we're not those people. We need to make sure, if we're a Christian, that we're not those people, that we're not spiritually blind. And that we open up and pay attention and not just think that we have all the answers because either we've believed this way for 50 years or my great grandma or great grandpa taught this, or my grandma taught this and grandpa taught this. And so this is the way I believe. That's not a solid foundation to build a theology on. And so we just need to make sure that we are open to truly understanding who Christ was, and not be like the Pharisees who weren't. They weren't open to change, to understanding who Christ was. And we need to make sure we are open to who Christ is. As always, I appreciate everyone for watching and turning in. If you haven't subscribed to our channel, please go ahead and do so. If you found this helpful, or if you're enjoying these, please share them with a friend, family, coworker, whoever, and share those. The more this gets out, the more we can help people do it. But as always, I appreciate everyone for watching.